Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, PFAS, Exposures and Regulations Across the Globe. I'm Dr. Barbara Malkus, Board President for Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition is dedicated to preventing environmental causes of breast cancer through community education, research advocacy, and changes to public policy. I am pleased to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Rainer Lohmann. Dr. Rainer Lohmann is a professor at the University of Rhode Island's Graduate School of Oceanography. Dr. Lohmann is also director of the URI-based Superfund Research Center on PFAS, called STEEP, in collaboration with scientists from Harvard T.H. School of Public Health and the Silent Spring Institute. Dr. Lohmann, welcome.
Thank you for the kind introduction and thank you for hosting me. Let me share my screen. Does this look right now?
It does, thank you.
Good, so then let me quickly do one more thing. All right. Good. Sorry, just trying to rearrange my screen so I can start talking. All right, so I'll talk in a little bit about PFAS exposure, what we know in general and in the US. And then the second half, I'll talk a little bit more regulation, what we know and what we might expect. So there's a little bit of guesswork because clearly the new administration has announced priorities without it being extremely clear what's going to happen. So I'll copied some of the most recent announcement and we can have a good guesstimate altogether what's going to happen next. So with that, maybe a quick introduction to the PFAS. So the key part of all these fluorinated substances is the fluorine itself. You might remember from high school chemistry that would be a green yellowish gas, which is highly acidic, and we use hydrofluoric acid to dissolve rocks. So clearly we know it's extremely potent and dangerous at the same time. Once we were able to harness its chemistry to produce fluorinated organic chemicals, so chemicals that have a carbon backbone and then are fluorinated, we started developing compounds like PFOA or PFOS, and those have become very infamous by now for their persistence in the environment and their effects on wildlife and humans. The two of the most common applications for PFOS was certainly the use in aqueous film forming foams, in which they're extremely powerful to extinguish fuel fires, and PFOA for decades was used to produce Teflon and other fluoropolymers. And because of that, we have unique products with Teflon and other fluoropolymers and unique pollution from its production and use and disposal. Teflon initially was accidentally discovered in the Manhattan Project, and it was then used to enrich uranium. It was used on the first lunar mission. And of course, these days, it has become a household name. It's probably one of the most recognizable trade names in the world. And of course, it has found its way into our homes through either Teflon coated kitchenware and or a wide range of textiles, often outdoor jackets, which have Gore-Tex brand often has PFAS coating and Teflon. The other part that makes PFAS unique is that there's several movies dedicated just to PFAS. The Devil We Know was probably the first one, which described the story of Robert Bellot in a series of depositions, documents, and so on. And then, of course, Dark Waters has the same story, just a little more dramatized in the Hollywood fashion with Mark Ruffalo. And so by and large, and I don't want to go through all these words, we can probably, again, cover this in just pictures. We know PFAS from household products, thinking of Scotchgard, Scotch cans, so 3M brands. Talked about outdoor jackets, fuel fires, and of course here is down at the bottom the picture of the water droplet not sticking to a fluorinated surface is the reason why they have become so useful in daily life and so pervasive and ubiquitous. As was mentioned during the introduction, I have the honor of working with a number of esteemed scientists and experts on a Superfund Research Center that we call STEEP, Sources, Transport, Exposure, and Effects of PFAS. And I'll cover some of our work. It's a combination of environmental engineering, environmental chemistry, toxicology, and epidemiology. And we have a training core, data management, community engagement. That is where our main partner is Silent Spring on Cape Cod. And of course, we have research translation, and they produce all kinds of materials for lay public, specific people, and you can find an idea of the kind of products we have at www.uri.edu/steep. So with that, I wanted to get into the exposure part, and the challenge is really that it's multifaceted, direct, indirect, what we call near field, far field. So a lot of times, basically, what we have is initially, of course, we buy consumer products and have exposure through those. Industry creates a wide range of coatings products. Some of those end up in waste. Landfills have leachate. Wastewater treatment plants have effluents. If you used the firefighting foam, that's obviously applied in the environment, and eventually some of that will percolate through the soil and either hit groundwater or surface waters. And so we know we have the release and the transfer of PFAS from the intended use to the unintended contamination of the environment. And that, of course, in the environment can start impacting the fish or shellfish or wild animals that we fish, harvest, game, hunt, but also if some of those PFAS reach agricultural fields, we can have contamination of some of the foods that we eat from agriculture. And that topic has, of course, risen to prominence in Maine particularly, but not only, where biosolids from wastewater treatment plants were used as fertilizers. In the Maine case, there was some inclusion of biosolids from pulp and paper mill factories, and that sludge was somewhat highly contaminated with PFAS. So several farmers in Maine had to basically shut down their dairy operations and their agricultural operations because of that contamination. So we have contamination or the exposure through the products we have in our homes, but also then through some of the foods that we're eating. And that creates the challenge of how to reduce this exposure and how to account for where all this exposure is coming from. So to give you some example of what this looks like, this is a study from 2 sites in China. On the left-hand side, you just see different food items and their concentration of different PFASs. UBay in red is a fluorochemical production site. Concentration are really high, and the other side, Zhejiang, is much lower. The key part is here on the right. You see these colored bars, and it shows by increasing length for the different compounds where the major exposure is from. And sorry, I just have to move things around a little bit here on my end. So the key part is everything in blue is linked to fish consumption. So for PFNA, decanoic acid, undecanoic, so the very long chain carboxylic acids, at least half or 3/4 or even more are typically from the consumption of fish. For the shorter chain compounds, so that there's PFPA, PFP, pentanoic acid, hexanoic acid, this is all green. Green are leafy vegetables. If we go to the background side, we see a somewhat similar story. Blue fish becomes important for the long chain carboxylic acids and PFOS, and otherwise green. So the leafy vegetables are important, and offal is important. So this already shows some of the complexity of human exposure that we have. Depending on what we eat and where we live and where the products are from, we will have somewhat different products and food items being responsible for uptake. Now, the good news is not all of those are considered highly toxic for humans, but nonetheless, we see there's different pathways that could be relevant. If we then look at a study in Europe by the European Food Safety Agency, they compiled an investigation into where typical Europeans would get their PFAS from. And so this is shown here for 20 odd individuals or lifestyle types. And the key part is that anything here in purple indicates fish and other seafood consumption. And basically around 80% of the typical European exposure is thought to come from the consumption of fish, shellfish, and snails. I guess that would be mostly for the French. So that is kind of a strong hint that fish is really a key part here. And so I wanted to use this to go to one of our STEEP partner sites that is on the Faroe Islands. Faroe Islands are this community in the middle of the North Atlantic between basically Scandinavia and Iceland. And they've had a history of eating whale meat. And as whales are high up in the food web, there has also been concern about their consumption of contaminants that are enriched in whales. And initially it was driven by mercury, then it was driven by PCBs, and over the last 10, 15 years, a lot of the concern has been on the exposure of this community by PFAS. And the good news is the Faroese health authorities have reacted. They've basically issued a do not eat advisory to all women of childbearing age. And that has actually worked. You start seeing big effects that women tend to have much lower levels these days of mercury and PFAS, whereas men, they're a little different. The unique thing the studies have been doing on the Faroe Islands is to find a way to test whether contaminants interfere with the immune system. In this particular case, Philippe Grandjean and Parwahi and all the collaborators who do the work have been following children from their birth to when they grow up. And in this particular case, the immunotoxicity, they relied on the fact that most Faroese children get routine vaccinations. And then 2 weeks later, they took a blood sample and looked whether the production of antibodies was impacted by the presence of PFAS in their blood. And this is probably the most famous result. This is the diphtheria vaccine. And 2 weeks after it was injected, of course, antibody production should ramp up. And you start seeing a strong effect of the more PFOS is in that child at age 5, the less the antibody production, the less antibodies are produced at age 7 when this investigation was performed. And that was really the driver behind a lot of the somewhat very low regulations on PFAS and drinking water, the fact of the immunotoxicity on the developing child. Now, of course, eating fish is not unique to the Faroe Islands. It's just a community that was had a very strong history of eating marine food, particularly marine mammals, so that are of course more contaminated. So now I wanted to get back to what we actually see in the US, and this has been published 2 years ago, showing concentration of PFAS in freshwater fish. Every dot shows a sampling location, and then you see concentration on a color coding where darker colors indicate more PFAS and lighter less PFAS. And of course, now it's easy to see that Great Lakes are particularly impacted, a lot of the dark colors, and a little bit the northeast, that's more on the Connecticut side, and a little bit in the Indiana, Tennessee region. So it's mostly an East Coast problem, not as much a West Coast problem. So this freshwater fish, and the overall profile of PFAS in those fish is typically PFOS, and that's very common. It's one of the most strongly bioaccumulating compounds, and it typically dominates exposure of most biological organisms that we're concerned with. There was one other assessment that was done prior. That was from the US EPA Great Lakes Human Health Study. So those 2 results are summarized here. And you can see that some of the most impacted fish are bass, the largemouth bass and the smallmouth. They tend to have among the greatest concentration, and it's not a big surprise, they're fairly high up in the food web. Catfish, as far as I know, are sediment-dwelling organisms, and those are typically more impacted than fish that swim and eat high up in the water. You see some of the salmon, of course, fish on the west coast are much cleaner. So we see this picture where some fish are strongly impacted, others not quite as much. And this is probably an important part to remember now. So I showed you the results from these two studies. One was from the US EPA National Rivers and Streams Assessment. The other is from the Great Lakes Human Health Fish Tissue Study. And then compared to that is a study that was published earlier by the US Food and Drug Administration that basically found very little PFAS. And those were from commercial fish. And that's an important distinction because a lot of the commercial fish the US that is present in the US is actually offshore. It's not necessarily American fish. And those were much, much cleaner. And at the time, there was some concern whether this was, whether the FDA's lacked sufficient detection limit, but I think they just sampled very different fish products than you would find if you go fishing yourself in somewhere in the continental US. And then, of course, you can use those numbers to come up with, if you eat some of those fish regularly, would you be much more exposed than a typical American? And those results are shown at the bottom. The two bars on the left show typical or median values of PFAS in the US Americans. The right-hand side, you see if you ate one fish meal a week from freshwater, you would exceed the typical dose. So clearly, eating local fish might be important depending on where you live. Work that Heidi Picard had done on the Cape, that's already a couple of years ago. She looked at different PFAS in fish and derived how much they bioaccumulate, so how much more enriched they are in the fish compared to the water. And we see these very typical profiles that basically explain everything I said before. These are the carboxylic acids, and as the chain length grows longer, bioaccumulation becomes very strong. So that's why we start seeing PFNA, PF tecanoic acid, and so on being highly enriched. And for the sulfonic acid, it's really PFOS, but there's actually additional compounds. Those are what we call the precursors that are also present in some fish. And that makes the risk assessment just a little more challenging for those who are the regulators. And we could show that indeed some of these compounds do enrich in fish quite strongly. This was also done on the Cape. This was in a mobile laboratory, so the exposure was to groundwater from the Joint Base Cape Cod. So this was before the water was treated, so it was highly contaminated. We exposed fathead minnows, and we could see a strong accumulation of several of these precursor compounds under these control conditions. So very much mirroring what Heidi observed in real fish from across the Cape. And of course, the several states have not ignored this challenge. So this is a summary of paper John Pitali wrote with several of us from STEEP, from the EPA and other organizations to look at what's the status of fish consumption advisories, in particular in the Northeast. Of course, we have typically very active governments. So there are several fish advisories issued. Often these are meant to prevent people from fishing in certain highly contaminated water bodies rather than blanket advisories, but it depends. And so, yeah, you see other parts of the country, that's not as big an issue, of course. I think clearly several states have a much more intimate connection to fish and fishing because they're coastal. And some of those, of course, have taken action much quicker than maybe some of the landlocked states. Yes, ignore this for your dinner tonight. So I talked about this before, so this has been the challenge. The exposure is somewhat complex. We know, of course, now fish, shellfish, for the general public could be important, but of course there's other exposure pathways, and this is kind of indicated here. You see food items, drinks, you see drinking water, you see inhalation. So there's different. I just want to touch on some of the other ones that could play a role. So one, I think this is well known, is the fact that you can get impacted by the product you have in your home. So this was a very unique study from Canada. This is already several years older. This was a family that, for whatever reason, regularly treated their carpets with Scotchgard. And then at this stage, they volunteered or got interested or scared about what impact that might have had on their own blood levels. And so these results are shown in this figure that has the blue outline. To the left are again typical concentration from US Americans from these average national measurements. And then right hand side, you see the father, the mother, and some of the children. And you see that their concentration bars are way higher than what is typical for US Americans. And the most likely link because it's the entire family. So it's not going to be occupational exposure of the parents, but it's something that happened in the home. And there's strong enrichment of PFOS and PFHXS, and we know some of those have been present in Scotchgard. And so yes, so this is this case, you got the clean carpet, but you also have the contaminated blood. And I think at this point we know that it's not really a treatment we want to really have any longer in the future. And of course, by now, 3M has changed its formulation. They don't use PFOS for a while. They use PFBS, and now they said they're going to get out of production of PFAS completely. So it's the times are changing. The other part, and this was some work we did with collaborators in California measuring PFAS in indoor air. We know because of the products that over time, the surfactants, the treatment that the carpets and textiles have will wear off. That's why you have to reapply coating to your boots, your rain jacket, the carpet, or the tablecloth, because over time the chemistry will be released either through abrasion, through emission, and so that also means it becomes mobile, and now it's present in the air and in dust. And one of the exposures, of course, that is relevant is for very young people, toddlers, because they crawl around and lick their fingers quite often, so they have a much higher ingestion of dust. That puts them much greater risk. So we went back to the Faroe Islands, and the reason we went back is when some of the earlier studies were published on PFAS in the communities of the Faroe Islands, you could clearly see there was some group that had very strong consumption of whale meat and had PFAS resulting from that and mercury. And there was another group of exposure that looked like it was from some domestic exposure that was more common. That was not just for those eating whale meat, but for much more common across the participants. And so we're trying to figure out whether the use of PFAS products would be a relevant pathway through air and dust on the Faroe Islands. And so we visited 40 homes of the roughly 500 participants of one of the latest cohorts and asked them to collect dust for 4 weeks. And we added a little sampling tube to their main living room, left it out there for 4 weeks. And that little sampling tube, it's shown here, collects PFAS from the air, enriches them, and then after 4 weeks, we take it back, analyze the dust, and come up with concentrations. Here's an example of what this might look like. So this is some indoor setting at one nondescript household, and you see there's our little sampling tube, so it's very not offensive, and it just takes up compounds over time. Maybe one last word before I get to the results. We also asked a lot of questions about the houses, and we're particularly interested whether There was a prevalence of carpets, because carpets we know are often linked to PFAS treatments. And it turns out in the Scandinavian culture, there's very little carpets. It was basically all hardwood floors. So that certainly was not an exposure pathway. And so these are some of the results we have. This is for concentrations in dust. The first couple of bars are the results from our study. These are some of what we call the precursor chemicals. And then we have other results from Europe, and the results are comparable to what others have observed. For the ionic compounds, our concentration may be a tad lower, but of course, these results are also from the 2020. Prior studies were earlier by 5 to 10 years, and clearly we know that PFAS have been phased out. Concentration must be coming down. So that's, but also on a remote island, people live in a normal lifestyle of fairly wealthy communities and have a wide range of products at home. So you can't escape PFAS, even if you live in a remote island. And for comparison, I found at least one set of results from North Carolina, and the results from North Carolina were much greater. That could indeed be linked to different products that are used on the US market. All right, and so now we wanted to see what are these different potential exposure pathways in the setting of a community that is really very heavily relying on marine foods. We tested the drinking water, they were all non-detect, and then we measured dust and air, and now we try to piece this all together, what kind of exposure this might result. There's some indication of how much pilot whale the average Faroese might eat. So it's about 80 grams per kilogram body weight per day. Sorry, 0.08 grams, sorry. So for an adult, this would be 20 grams a day or so. And then we try to derive the estimated daily intake for a child, because children will be much more vulnerable to the presence of PFAS in dust, and compare this to what the European Union thinks is tolerable, which is about 4.4 nanograms per kilogram body weight per week. So pilot whale accounts for a lot of that tolerable daily intake, but not all. And then on the, we call the low end exposure. So this is a normal healthy child. It's not that active, not that heavy, doesn't consume that much dust. Air and dust play no role. If, however, we have a highly exposed child, so this could be a child that has much more hand-to-mouth contact, has a higher ventilation rate, a breathing rate, then dust and air would actually contribute almost as much as the pilot whale and bring it just above the safe limit. So depending on the specific scenario, this other exposure can play an important role. And so kind of to wrap up this fish part of the talk, certainly the kind of foods you eat and certainly marine mammals can play an important role, but we know there are additional exposures, and dust is typically more important than just breathing. There were no clear links between air, dust, and serum themselves. And so I think in the US market, certainly some of the concerns would be anything that used to be stain repellent for exposure. And I'm not sure when I should have put this in, but I put it in now. I talked a lot about nanograms, so just a reminder, nanogram is not very much. We're talking about 10 grains of table salt, an Olympic-sized swimming pool, then we get to about a nanogram per liter. So it's extremely tiny concentration, but that's the levels at which PFAS are regulated now. So this is from Gloria Post, showing how over time the concentration that is considered safe for different PFAS in drinking water has changed. And you can see this on the left here for PFOA, excuse me. You can see this on the left for PFOA and on the right-hand side for PFOS. You see the same trend on both graphs. Initially, the safe dose was considered to be very high. We're talking 10,000s of nanograms per liter in West Virginia. And then over time, particularly since 2010, this safe number has decreased to about 10 nanograms per liter. This is for PFOA, and for PFOS we have a similar story. So the concern has changed dramatically. That has a lot to do with immunotoxic effects, just like the one I showed. And so a lot of states have set their own drinking water values. Denmark, as far as I know, is still the country that has reached for the strictest limitation on PFAS in drinking water. They regulate 4 of the main bioaccumulating compounds at 2 nanograms per liter. And of course, the US EPA proposed 2 years ago to go fairly low. And so the US EPA actually did 2 steps. One was the health advisory. The health advisory basically said what is considered safe from a health perspective. And at that time, PFOA and PFOS basically both were realized as carcinogens or likely carcinogens. And so they basically said it's really only safe at extremely low doses, or basically there is no safe dose. So they came out with 0.04, 0.004 or 0.02 parts per trillion, which are difficult to measure. For Gen X, the EPA suggested 10 parts per trillion, and for PFBS, 2,000. Now, in March 2023, the US EPA proposed the maximum contaminant levels of 4 parts per trillion for PFOA because of kidney and testicular cancer, 4 parts per trillion for PFOS, pancreatic cancer, and so there's really no safe level. The concentration of 4 was a compromise. It was not based on health only, but the MCL is a compromise between health considerations, feasibility, detectability, and technological implementation. And the 4 was chosen as a number that is easily detectable by standard commercial laboratories. And yeah. And then for the other contaminants, the EPA followed a slightly different approach. They call it a hazard index, and they basically regulate PFHXS, the Gen X chemicals, and PFNA at basically 10 parts per trillion, and PFBS at 2,000. And then the sum of those 3 can't exceed any of these particular numbers, and there's a way you can calculate this. So this was quite a stunning announcement. That was under the prior administration. It's going to be costly, that much is for certain. I think the estimated cost is about $1 billion a year over the next 50 years. There have been some settlements of 3M and DuPont with the drinking water providers, and that accounted for roughly 14 billion, and the rest presumably is going to be paid by money from the Infrastructure Act. I just wanted to do a quick excuse me, comparison. Massachusetts, which has been fairly progressive, instituted to regulate 6 PFAS at 20 parts per trillion. And I just wanted to see how this compares. So if you take EPA's numbers, PFOA at 4, PFOS at 4, the other 3 at 10, you come up with 18. So the numbers are actually very similar. The only difference is that EPA is, of course, a little more protective, because under Massachusetts law, a drinking water supply that had, let's say, PFOA only at 18 parts per trillion would be considered safe, but EPA says if it's above 4, it has to be treated. So there's less loopholes, if you wish, in the EPA approach. And I understand that basically in all states, there's a complementarity, basically saying that you have to follow both. So any water has to abide by the EPA rules, but also the mass rules. An example could be if PFOA is at 3, PFOS is at 3, and these other 3 are at 5 total, it would, but then there is HPA is present at 10. This is not regulated by EPA, but it's regulated by mass. So there could be a situation where EPA considers this safe water, mass would consider it not safe, so then the mass rule would apply, otherwise the EPA rules apply. So in a way, it's protective and protective. But I think I just wanted to say that the numbers are not that different in the end. So that's pretty good sign. Most of the New England states have had somewhat similar levels of around 20 for 5 or 6 compounds, and they by and large agree in the reasoning with the EPA approach. There has been a lot of activity, so I move on to the regulation side by the federal government. This was put out under the prior administration, how to regulate and combine all the different agencies and ministries. We'll see where this ends. I think everybody realized it's a complex set because you have to deal particularly with contaminated sites. You have to figure out how many people are exposed. That's easy for the public drinking waters because they have to be tested, but the private wells is a bit of a difficult one. Big concern is the handling. So these are places like landfills, wastewater treatment providers, because they of course receive PFAS as part of the waste stream they handle. And the question is, can they be liable because of the products they receive? And then of course there's all the sampling to be done. All right, I wanted to end on, well, not just sure it's speculation, but this came out only a few days ago. This is from the new EPA Administrator Zeldin, and he's trying to strengthen science, fulfilling statutory obligations, enhance communication, build partnerships. So that's kind of the announcement on PFAS. And if you look at the details, these are the 6 highlights that came out as his announcement on PFAS. And he wants to have a designated agency lead on PFAS. He wants to implement PFAS testing informed by hazard characteristic exposure pathways. Well, this might sound very technical. It's basically industry's preferred approach to dealing with exposure assessment, because this means there's no blanket treatment of PFAS as a group, but rather individuals. Importantly, he says EPA should launch additional efforts for air emissions of PFAS and how to measure those. And of course, identify gaps, provide more frequent updates to how to destruct PFAS and dispose of them. Of course, that's a role where EPA is uniquely suited because they're kind of neutral, so they're not beholden by industrial methods. And last part is, of course, he wants EPA to ramp up the development of PFAS testing methods, typically where EPA sets standards that everybody then uses. So clearly there are important roles for EPA science. At the same time, EPA's Office of Research and Development is under threat to be culled, so we'll see how those square up. The next part he's expressed interest in was the fulfilling the statutory obligations, enhancing communication. So there's a lot of detail. I think what I wanted to add on here, there's achieve more effective outcomes by prioritizing risk-based review of new and existing chemicals, smartly collect necessary information. So yes, this administration made clear they think EPA should not hinder business and development. So clearly they're trying to reduce the onus on industries who produce or use PFAS. So we'll see how that squares away with the fact that, of course, they want to protect the environment and the public from PFAS. And then lastly, of course, I think this was a priority oriented. The first administration is to advance remediation and cleanup. Of course, this is very important. We have plenty of contaminated sites, and the sooner we get them cleaned, the less money we have to pay for long-term remediation afterwards. We'll see what happens. The EPA has published a biosolids risk assessment. We'll see what stance EPA takes on this. But by and large, I thought the announcement by the administrator highlighted that PFAS remain a bipartisan issue. Clearly, he's aware of the concerns, so I thought it was on the good side. So what do we do with these complex exposures? Ideally, of course, we try to intercept PFAS in as many places as possible, and steps have been taken. So, for example, as of a few years ago, Congress mandated that the military should not use fluorinated aqueous film-forming foam any longer. And suddenly, there was a lot of effort into research and development, we basically have non-fluorinated aqueous film forming foam that are basically just as effective, and with very few exceptions, what can be used. We have seen a lot of action on consumer products where PFAS mostly are not necessary, and of course, ideally, we want to make sure we reduce exposure also through, and the focus here often has been through providing or establishing, installing treatment for drinking water. So those are kind of the obvious pathways. I talked a lot about fish. That is when the PFAS have already left the intended use, and that to have concentration that fish come down would just take a little longer. In the EU, the proposal has been to basically phase out PFAS as a group, with exceptions for where PFAS are really essential for health or safety or the function of society. So there's a lot of consultation. The European Union is going through these motions of where PFAS are needed or not. Typically, these are really not consumer products any longer. But these are technical products. This could be, do we need PFAS in solar cells, in lithium-ion batteries, in the production of semiconductors? And in a lot of places, PFAS have unique uses and are not going to be easily phased out. But if an exemption is granted, then of course there's an incentive to reduce emissions and find alternatives. And I was going to say this, of course, not linked to the EU. We've seen a lot of actions by states in the US, particularly in the Northeast, but not only. And so they've been active. Maine has probably been the most ambitious to phase out PFAS in all products, unless there's an absolute necessity to have it in. I think Minnesota has just followed a similar approach. I think on the West Coast we have similar ideas. A lot of states have passed laws and/or regulations to limit PFAS in certain products, and that kind of is an application of this idea of essential use. So suddenly PFAS are not allowed in food contact materials, in textiles, maybe in cosmetics, aqueous film forming foam. So all of these actions, of course, have helped because they reduce the amount of PFAS being used, and they will eventually lead to less exposure. The compliance of how the New England states are going to monitor whether the products on the market adhere to those rules is a little less clear. And I think biosolid use is kind of the next or last, I'm not sure, battleground where there's a lot of concern about the use of biosolids as fertilizer. But because of the immense volumes and the costs of either putting them in landfills or incinerating them, it's unclear how this is going to go. All right, with that, I wanted to end on Massachusetts because that's where MBCC is based. Massachusetts has been fairly active. They've collected almost 50,000 gallons of AFFF over the last few years. They have an act to reduce toxic composite firefighting gear. They were looking at sludge disposal or reduction of PFAS options, then extensive monitoring in water across the state, drinking water, surface water, groundwater, fish, effluents, biosolid sediments. They, of course, have set up the MCL at 20 parts per trillion. And Massachusetts has this unique toxic use reduction institute to look into toxic compounds and how to reduce them. So, of all the places to be in, Massachusetts, probably one of the better ones in terms of PFAS. And so this is the summary, which hasn't really changed. US EPA surprised, I think, a lot of us through this extremely ambitious health goal of 0. And then with rather low MCLs, of course, this is now contested in the courts. We don't know how it's going to go. At the same time, the new administration is unclear which role they're going to take. We know we have plenty of exposure pathways. Drinking water is a main one, but not the dominant one. And the other ones are more difficult to tackle. And there's no coherent strategy yet in place across the US how to reduce PFAS from products. All right, with that, I want to thank some of our funding agencies and of course you for listening. And now I'm trying to get out of this. And I'm open to any questions.
Was having a little technical difficulty there. If any of our listeners would like to ask Dr. Lohmann a question, you can post it in the question drop-down menu of your panel of your GoToWebinar, which is among the little gray field of different drop-down menus. You'll see one that says question. If you click that open, you'll be able to type in your question, and I will be monitoring that. So we did have a question earlier, Dr. Lohmann. I'm going to ask, it's related to the first question that you have, and I think it's because there's so many different ways that the maximum contaminant level, or the MCL, is being measured. So there was a question regarding like just kind of understanding scale. So when you said there were 349 nanograms per kilogram, and I believe it was with respect to the whale meat that was being consumed in the Faroe Islands, like, is that something to, like, is that very large? Is that, like, in comparison to the other MCLs that are being identified, for example, in water or in other means of exposure?
Sure. So the estimation by EPA for exposure assumes that 20% comes from drinking water, and the rest is up to whatever else you do in your life. So that typically is mostly food. And so by and large, as I said, most of the exposure is typically through food, often it's seafood. And so the whale number is on the higher side. Most of us luckily don't eat whales, so we don't really have that problem.
Right.
And from what I understand,
in terms of scale, people who live in that culture where they are more likely to eat whale are getting a higher exposure because of the bioaccumulation that ends up being in whale meat. So I know the answer to this question, but I think I'm going to make sure that you answer it for our listener. How long do these stay in your body? And is there a way to get it out of your body once they have accumulated? And what are the symptoms, short and long term, of having a higher than what is considered acceptable MCL?
Yeah, so let me start with how long they reside in our bodies. I mean, it varies, but the compounds we're most concerned with, for which we have the MCLs in place, talking years, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7. The numbers vary. It depends on the individuals, on the chemical, and so and we know that from studies where people were exposed inadvertently through drinking water, and once the exposure stopped, you could start seeing how the levels in their blood came down. And then you have some idea how long they last. So we're talking years. For us, the challenge, of course, is that we can't stop taking up PFAS just by wanting it, right? It's not that easy because they're almost everywhere. Ways to reduce yes, there are ways to reduce your body burden. None of them are necessarily very easy. There's one way. I don't want to become as funny. So if you give birth, you pass on some of your PFAS to the child. That's one. If you donate blood, because a lot of PFAS are bound to albumin in the blood, if you donate blood, you also lower your PFAS body burden. Of course, then the problem is what happens to your blood. And then there are medical ways. If you are tested, I think cholestyramine seems to be working as a drug, and there seems to be some ways if you have particular fiber treatments so there are ways, and there are some communities that have been highly exposed that are very concerned about this. And so there are some promising options that seem to be working. And last question was about the effects. I'm not a toxicologist, but I think 2 or 3 years ago, there was guidance from the National Academies of Medicine on what doctors should do if there's concern about PFAS. And clearly by now you can fairly easily find out where PFAS contaminated sites are. So if you think you're on one of those sites, you should talk to your doctor. They would probably, I assume, be convinced eventually that they'll test your blood. I think this can be covered now by health insurance. And there's certain things to look for, because we know some of the most extreme effects include certain cancers. They're also linked to high cholesterol. So there are certain effects that your primary care physicians should look for and see whether anything is changing as you grow older. So I think that's the best guidance I can give, and I think that is all available on the web. So there's basic guidance for practitioners how to monitor people who might have been unusually high exposure.
And I will indicate that on the mbcc.org website, there is information that for healthcare providers, that if someone has a concern, they're able to actually take that information and share it with their primary care provider. Another one of our listeners has asked, trifluoroacetic acid, or TFA, has emerged as a significant PFAS broadly distributed. So, you know, what are you familiar with this, and what is the impact of this particular version of PFAS? Is it being measured for PCL?
Yeah, so somebody is paying close attention. Yes, trifluoroacetic, or TFA, is, so it's the shortest of all the possible PFAS. So it's only one fluorinated carbon and then an acid group. It is increasing. It has been increasing very fast over the last few decades. It's an unusual PFAS because its main source is actually the breakdown of fluorinated gases. So these are the gases that were used when we phased out ozone depleting substances. Because of the ozone hole, we started switching to compounds that are more reactive and don't have this ozone depleting potential. And some of those in the atmosphere break down to TFA, which then rains out. And because of that, we see increasing concentrations in surface waters or in vegetation of TFA. TFA is present in a much greater concentration than basically any of the PFAS we're talking about. I'm not a toxicologist. We know it's not going to be retained by the body anywhere close to PFOA or PFOS, so it's probably going to be flushed out somewhat quickly. It's unclear at what stage you might have to worry about exposure. I think we're not there yet. The only concern is because it's such a small molecule, it's not easy to remove it from water. And so as a precautionary approach, it would seem wise to not phase out these fluorinated gases, but industry has slightly different ideas what is considered precautionary in this.
So you know, who is doing that kind of medical research on how these chemicals affect the human system, the human body? And then what is, we've heard about how bad they are, but I've not seen any real studies about like the cause and effect.
Yeah, in terms of studies, it's typically a mix of controlled animal studies, where you take a rodent, often expose it to a certain amount, and then watch what kind of effects you see. And then, of course, you pair that with epidemiological studies, where basically survey a certain amount of individuals that inadvertently have been exposed through their lives, and watch for effects as this group grows older, and you know their blood concentrations. That's the thing you can measure the most easily, and then do correlations if those with a higher concentration end up developing certain conditions more strongly. That's basically why we know now that these cancer types are very prevalent: kidney, testicular, there's one more that I forgot now, liver. And the results you also see in rodents, so there's overlap, and that's when you say, yeah, the evidence is strong. That's roughly how it works. The challenge with TFA is just because it's so soluble, the exposure would have to be done through drinking water for the mice, and it's just more difficult to do. And on the human side, because it doesn't bioaccumulate as much, you can't use blood really as a good exposure matrix. So you would have to measure the urine. So it's more complicated.
Is there any ability to test at home? Are there home tests for consumers to test PFAS in the water?
Yes. The simple answer is yes. The but is that it's often costly unless the state would cover it. I'm not sure I think at this stage, Massachusetts offered free private well testing. I'm not sure they still do.
Mm.
So in which case you would have to basically ship it out to a commercial lab or find somebody who's happy to do it anyhow. There is a company that offers a test kit that they ship to you. You pour your water through and then ship it back. I think that's cheaper. I assume these are people that know what they're doing. I think it's an NIH supported startup. So that's probably another option. I forgot the brand name. But so there are options. But yes, unfortunately, the chemistry behind this is expensive.
Mm. You know, what is the situation in Europe with the PFAS phase out? Like are they moving ahead because of their level of awareness and concern with regards to the environment, or is there a concern that that may in fact happen considering some of the changes for funding research?
Yeah, it's so there's two parts in Europe. One is the European Commission, which kind of the governing body of the European Union is going through the motions of what uses are important or essential, which ones are not. And that has certain committees, there's stakeholder input, so all of this goes its way. Eventually they reach some conclusion, find a document, but then it'll be decided by the head of the national governments.
Mm.
And some of those governments are under very strong pressure by industry to relax those rules. So ultimately, the outcome is unknown, and it's going to be a political decision, not a health not necessarily just a health or technological feasibility decision. Yes, we don't know.
You know, one of the concerns with so much of funding being cut for research is that many of our scientists will look to go and especially our young scientists who are completing their degrees may look to go to foreign universities and colleges where they can get some financial support for completing their degrees and completing their research. Is that something that will impact our understanding of PFAS and how we deal with PFAS?
Yes, most likely. Just before this webinar, I read that NIH will cut any funding to foreign entities. That would include the funding for the Faroe Islands. We're not sure when this is implemented, and it might be stopped by the courts, as many other actions have. But yes, the writing on the wall is very clear. The science funding will probably be cut in half. So you have a lot less funding, you have a lot less PFAS science. You have an administration that is more interested in deregulation. I think they're just trying to thread a fine needle to honor at least lip service to PFAS contamination, but clearly they're more industry friendly than the prior administration. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, it's not looking very good right now for science in this country.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lohmann. We're coming up to the end of our time, and I want to express my appreciation for sharing your research and your knowledge with us. I think that prevention, being a main focus of MBCC, is something that everyone needs to consider when it comes to PFAS and take those measures to limit exposures. On behalf of myself, the MBCC board, and Cheryl Osimo, MBCC's executive director, I want to thank Dr. Lohmann for this very informative discussion today. And I want to thank all of our many listeners for joining us. For those interested, the recording of this webinar will be made available later today on the MBCC website at mbcc.org. And if you would like to further support our mission of preventing environmental causes of breast cancer, please consider making a donation by visiting mbcc.org/donate. I appreciate your consideration. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.